On April 15th, 1865, Lincoln died behind a velvet curtain. Days later, his body traveled 1,600 miles by train. 1 million people viewed his face through glass. In Cleveland, a mourner left a letter folded in a wreath. It read only, "To the man who freed him." It was unsigned. What else was carried in silence? A wreath unopened, a letter unread, a page destroyed. Between 1865 and 1900, embalming became industry. Lincoln's body set the precedent for funerals that followed. When death became public, what else was bought and sold? Welcome to History's Ledger. On the morning of April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died behind a velvet curtain. By nightfall, his body was already being prepared, not only for burial, but for display. A man had become symbol, a death had become precedent. This is not only a story of assassination or mourning, it is about what followed. How embalming, coffins lined with satin and glass panes fitted into lids, turned private grief into public ceremony. How a single journey by train gave rise to an industry that would reshape mourning into commerce. We will walk through halls heavy with lilies, under velvet drapery, past candelabras hissing with gaslight. We will see letters left unsigned, wreaths that held secrets, and faces retouched again and again until grief itself became performance. So let us turn the page. Let us step into the quiet rooms where sorrow was staged and where death first became business. On April 14th, 1865, Ford's Theatre filled with laughter, gas lamps fogging their glass. Then came the crack of a pistol. Within minutes, Abraham Lincoln was carried across 10th Street to the Peterson boarding house. His long frame barely fit the narrow stairwell. Witnesses remembered the hush, wallpaper with faded roses, floorboards creaking under boots. Laid in a back bedroom, he lingered through the night. Doctors worked by lamplight, instruments spread on a bureau. The air smelled of chloroform, sweat, and iron. Mary Todd sobbed from the hallway, her black dress rustling. Cabinet members stood in silence, shadows long across the walls. At 7:22 a.m., April 15th, the president was gone. A soldier drew a velvet curtain around the bed, muffling street noise. Stillness heavier than grief filled the room. Stanton's words broke it. Now, he belongs to the ages. Arrangements began before candles burned out. Couriers hurried with orders for crepe, ribbons, flags. An undertaker summoned, an embalmer readied. Lincoln's body was no longer private. It belonged to the state, to the nation. The Peterson house smelled of tallow and tobacco long after he was removed. The bed frame remained, but the sheets were gone. Tourists would one day file past, peering at stillness frozen in time. But in that morning, it was only silence, velvet, and the faint trace of chloroform. Would you have stood in that hallway for a glimpse, or turned away, unable to watch grief become something larger than family, the first funeral staged for a republic. Embalming was not born with Lincoln. It reached him in fragments through war and grief in the White House. In May 1861, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, Lincoln's young friend, was shot hauling down a Confederate flag. His body, carried to Washington, became a test for Dr. Thomas Holmes, an ambitious embalmer. Ellsworth's coffin bore a glass window trimmed in gilt. Thousands filed past, the air thick with candle smoke and gaslight. A livid paleness, wrote the New York Times, yet people marveled. 10 days dead, still visible. Science or spectacle? The practice touched Lincoln again in February 1862. Willie, his 11-year-old son, died of fever in the White House. Embalming slowed the fading, let the family keep him longer. Lilies crowded rooms until their perfume soured, candles smoked, wax pooling in silver dishes. Visitors whispered the house smelled of both flowers and chemicals. Lincoln had seen Ellsworth embalmed, had chosen it for his son. He must have sensed it could be his turn. Could he imagine his own face behind glass? His coffin wheeled through streets lined in velvet, his body touched again and again by embalmers. The war made embalming common. Over 600,000 died. Perhaps 40,000 were embalmed so families could claim bodies. Chemicals, camphor, zinc, arsenic, clung to coffins opened at train stations, mourners pressing gloves to faces as the odor escaped. And with need came profit. Practitioners hovered near battlefields, bargaining with desperate families. So many abuses arose that the War Department issued General Order No. 39 in 1865 to regulate the trade. By then, embalming had already crossed from necessity to expectation. Ellsworth's gilt coffin, Willie's embalmed form, soldiers carried home in wooden boxes lined with zinc. All of it pointed toward Lincoln. Picture yourself in a rotunda. Wax and roses choke the air. You step forward, peering into a coffin trimmed with silver. Behind glass lies a pale face retouched by powder. Do you feel reverence or discomfort that grief itself had become display? At dawn on April 15th, Lincoln's body lay in a White House chamber, curtains drawn, air heavy with lamp oil and damp wool. Crowds pressed outside. Inside, silence, broken only by boots scuffing and crepe rustling across mirrors. Two men entered, Dr. Charles Brown and Dr. Henry Cattell. Embalming, still strange to Americans, had come from Europe and spread through the Civil War. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been embalmed so they could be sent home. Their coffins lined with zinc, the air sharp with camphor and arsenic. Now, it was the President's turn. The room smelled of camphor and alcohol. Brown mixed his formula. Cattell laid out instruments on walnut, polished to a shine. Jackets shed, sleeves rolled. They worked. The wound was closed, the body washed and dressed in black. Cosmetics followed, powders dusted across skin, lips reshaped, rouge pressed faintly to cheeks. The coffin was no plain box, walnut, satin-lined, silver-trimmed, a glass pane fitted for the nation to see him. For a moment, illusion held, but embalming was not one act. It was repeated again and again. Cattell rode with the funeral train, opening his trunk of powders and brushes in Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia. By lamplight he retouched the face, vinegar cloths on the brow, rouge brushed on lips, powders over darkened skin. Witnesses whispered that by Manhattan the features were altered, one shrunken. Still, the lines outside never shortened. Picture the halls, marble floors echoing with boots, skirts brushing velvet ropes, chandeliers hissing with gaslight, the air thick with lilies, their sweetness cloying, nearly choking. Mourners leaned close, gloves brushing glass polished smooth. A child left violets. A woman placed a folded letter in the wreath. To the man who freed him. Unsigned, never opened. Brown and Cattell had made this possible. A nation wasn't looking at memory but preservation. And in preservation, grief itself was reshaped. Would you have leaned closer to see through glass, or stepped back, uneasy that sorrow had become performance? The coffin was walnut, lined with white satin, silver trimmed, a glass pane for the nation to look through. Ostrich plumes crowned the hearse, their feathers dripping with April rain. On April 21st, 1865, the train pulled from Washington. Smoke billowed over velvet-draped cars. Inside, crystal candelabras flickered, brass fittings gleamed, and flowers filled the air with a sweetness already turning sour. The route retraced Lincoln's 1861 inaugural journey, only in reverse. 1,600 miles, 7 states, 180 towns. At every stop, halls transformed overnight. Marble pedestals raised beneath velvet swags. Flags draped ceilings. Gaslight hissed from chandeliers. Crowds stretched for blocks, some waiting all night in rain. Boots clattered on marble, skirts brushed velvet ropes, the air thick with lilies and sweat. In Philadelphia, the coffin rested in Independence Hall, dais wrapped in velvet. The perfume of lilies and roses burned throats. A woman pressed her glove to the glass. Did she see Lincoln as he was, or as she wished? In New York, whispers spread. His features seemed altered, wan, shrunken, darkened by travel. At night, Dr. Cattell opened his trunk, retouching by lamplight. Rouge brushed on lips, powder across hollow cheeks. Preservation became performance. Still, the people came. In Cleveland, crowds jammed the rotunda, wreaths piled high. One wreath held a folded note. To the man who freed him. Unsigned, unopened, lost among the flowers. The train moved on, its wheels pounding, sparks rising into night. Inside, satin glowed under candlelight. Outside, villagers watched lamplight flicker through black crepe curtains. Would you have stood in line for hours to glimpse through glass, or turned away, uneasy at grief staged in satin and gaslight? Mary Lincoln wanted her husband carried home quietly to Springfield. Edwin Stanton insisted otherwise. The Secretary of War turned grief into pageant, extending the journey city by city, designing each hall as theater. In Washington, the Capitol Rotunda was draped in velvet. Gaslight candelabras hissed, flames mirrored in bronze railings. Soldiers moved in silence, rolling out crimson carpets. Stanton walked with clasped hands, correcting flags, wreaths, and brass finials. Nothing was too small. Mourning was performance. The hearse was built like no other, a black carriage trimmed in gold, crowned with black ostrich plumes that swayed like whispers. Horses wore velvet harnesses studded with silver. Drums beat slow as it moved through crowds. At each stop, Stanton's hand was visible. Marble pedestals cold under wreaths of lilies and roses, black crepe heavy on balconies, French mourning ribbons glistening faint in candlelight. Perfume thickened halls until it suffocated. In Philadelphia, the coffin rested under Independence Hall's dome, velvet banners sweeping floor to ceiling. Thousands pressed in all night through rain, boots dripping on marble. Some fainted in the crush, carried away as dirges echoed off stone. In New York, the catafalque rose high, draped in crepe and silver braid. Flags 30 feet long hung above gaslit haze. Musicians played dirges while over 100,000 shuffled through. Lincoln's face, retouched nightly by Dr. Cattell, appeared thinner, wan, but still the crowds came. In Cleveland, among the towering wreaths, someone slipped a folded letter into the flowers. To the man who freed him. No name, never opened, disappeared with the train. Stanton had remade mourning into spectacle. Marble, velvet, lilies, and plumes bound the Republic in grief. Yet something more private vanished in the excess, a silence drowned beneath pageantry. Would you have felt comfort beneath chandeliers and velvet, or unease that sorrow had been staged into theater? On April 21st, 1865, the train left Washington. Coal smoke trailed the sky, whistles sharp as morning. Behind the engine came a car swathed in black crepe. Inside, Lincoln's coffin rested on a satin dais, ostrich plumes swaying with the rails. The journey stretched 3 weeks, 1,600 miles, 180 towns. Each stop demanded repetition. Coffin lifted, dais draped, velvet swags rehung, wreaths stacked higher. The body was not laid to rest. It was carried as symbol. Inside the car, the air was close. Wax and lilies masked the sharper bite of chemicals. Dr. Henry Cattell traveled with his trunk. Brushes, powders, vinegar cloths. At night, he opened the coffin, working by candlelight to hold illusion. Rouge on lips, powder on hollowed cheeks. Preservation became nightly ritual. At each city, halls turned into stages. In Harrisburg, marble pedestals, velvet swags, candelabras dripping heat. Crowds shuffled through, boots echoing, gloves brushing glass. The lilies' perfume burned throats. Some leaned close enough to fog the pain. In Cleveland, rain lashed banners, umbrellas dripping as mourners filled the rotunda. One wreath held a folded note to the man who freed him. No name, never opened, lost among blossoms. By New York, strain showed. Witnesses whispered of a face altered, wan, darkened. Still the line stretched for blocks, hats clutched to chests, gaslight glaring on marble. The coffin was opened 13 times. Each reopening offered comfort. Each closing pretended finality. The man became symbol, the body illusion. Would you have followed that train, waiting hours to peer through glass, or turned away, uneasy that mourning had become performance? Before the war, death was private. Families washed the body, dressed it in Sunday clothes, laid it in the parlor, and lowered it into a pine coffin within a day. Few ornaments, little delay. The Civil War changed that. 600,000 dead, many far from home. Families demanded bodies returned. Without intervention, it was impossible, so embalmers appeared with satchels of arsenic and camphor. For $30, they promised to preserve a soldier long enough for the journey. By 1865, the government issued licenses and set prices, but the trade had already flourished. Lincoln's embalmed face turned practice into precedent. A million saw him preserved behind glass. Newspapers called it miraculous. Families soon asked undertakers for the same. Time to grieve, time to gather, time to display love. Embalming, once battlefield necessity, became expectation. Funeral homes replaced parlors. Undertakers rebranded as funeral directors, managing coffins, flowers, etiquette. Coffins lined in satin, silver fittings, windows for final viewings became common. Mourning rooms glowed with chandeliers, velvet curtains muffled outside sound. Embalming stretched grief. Relatives could travel, wakes extended days. Death was arranged as ceremony, rather than endured as abrupt silence. And commerce followed. Mourning became language in fabric and stone. Crepe veils imported from France, jet brooches, gleaming black. Gloves dyed the color of ash. Stationery edged in black. Etiquette books dictating proper dress. Lilies and roses ordered in wagon loads, their perfume masking chemical undertones. Imagine entering such a room in 1870. Heavy curtains drawn, chandeliers dimmed, coffin on a velvet dais, brass glinting in candlelight. The air dense with lilies, cloying against the throat. Was it comfort or display? Lincoln's satin coffin had taught a nation to expect more. Out of his death grew an industry that promised dignity wrapped in satin and silver, but never without a price. Would you have embraced it, paying for ceremony and permanence, or resisted, preferring the older silence of pine and earth? After Lincoln's funeral, mourning itself became stagecraft. Closing shutters and draping mirrors was no longer enough. Grief was made public, worn on bodies, displayed in homes, mailed on paper. By the 1870s, etiquette manuals dictated how to mourn. A widow wore heavy crepe for a year, then eased into half mourning of greys and purples. Men wore black armbands or cravats. Children were dressed in somber fabrics, bright ribbons replaced with black. Sorrow became uniform. Shops flourished. Mourning emporiums sold satin-lined coffins, veils from France, black-edge stationery, jet combs and brooches. Undertakers displayed coffins upright under chandeliers, their brass fittings gleaming. Even gas lamps were shaded so their light seemed dimmer, as though grief had altered illumination itself. Letters became ritual. Condolences sent on thick black bordered paper, violet petals pressed between sheets, tied in ribbon as records of sorrow. Homes shifted too, curtains drawn heavy, clocks stopped in rooms of death, parlors stripped of color. Lilies crowded mantles, their perfume cloying, masking the sharp tang of embalming fluid. Photography blurred lines further. Posthumous portraits posed children propped against pillows, their stillness mistaken for sleep. Families displayed them beside living kin, a visual elegy framed in black. All of it was reinforced by Lincoln's Precedent. His embalmed face, viewed by millions, taught Americans that grief could be prolonged, shared, even purchased. And where there was ritual, there was profit. Picture a widow in 1880, veiled in crepe, hair pinned with jet combs, clutching a prayer book bound in black leather. Behind her, carriages draped in velvet roll passed, ostrich plumes trembling in the rain. Is this comfort or performance? Would you have followed every rule, mourning for years in prescribed colors, or broken them, grieving quietly without crepe, risking whispers of disrespect? When Lincoln's coffin closed in Springfield, the sound was final, brass clasps echoing like punctuation. Yet it was more than an ending. It set precedent. Before 1865, most Americans buried their dead swiftly in pine coffins, lowered within a day. Death was intimate, private, unadorned. After Lincoln, expectations shifted. A president embalmed, carried 1,600 miles, his face behind glass, satin beneath, silver trim gleaming. This was no farewell, but performance. Families soon wanted the same. They asked for time, for display, for ritual. Undertakers rebranded as funeral directors. Parlors glowed with velvet curtains, gas chandeliers, mahogany coffins lined with satin, windows fitted for viewing. Death became spectacle arranged in advance, but illusion strained. By New York, Lincoln's face was whispered to be wan and shrunken. Dr. Henry Cattell labored nightly, brushing powder, pressing rouge, cooling the skin with vinegar. Preservation became retouching, reverence edging into performance. Rumors spread of photographs, some said taken, then destroyed or sealed away. Were they too disturbing, too revealing? The absence itself feels louder than any surviving print. What truth was burned? What image withheld? Luxury masked fragility at every step. Ostrich plumes bent in rain, velvet swags soot-stained, imported ribbons fluttered, while the body within required powders to resemble itself. Yet the nation accepted it as model, that embalming must preserve, that coffins must display, that mourning must be staged. This was Lincoln's legacy beyond politics, not just freedom, but the transformation of death itself, from private silence into public precedent. Would you have leaned close to glass, believing you were seeing him, or stepped back, uneasy that reverence had become illusion? The war ended, but its trade endured. Embalmers who once worked battlefields returned to cities, now calling themselves funeral directors. What had been a hurried craft became showroom business. Parlors gleamed, coffins no longer plain pine, but polished mahogany, quilted in satin, fitted with brass handles heavy to the touch. Some even had glass windows so families could look one last time. Chandeliers scattered lamplight across silver fittings. The air was layered, beeswax, lilies, and always that faint chemical tang. Families entered hushed. A widow might trace a gloved hand along walnut polished smooth. A child might pause before towering wreaths, the perfume thick and almost suffocating. Mourning had become a marketplace. Etiquette books, sold alongside coffins, taught how long to wear crepe, how to pin mourning ribbons, how to write condolences on black-edged stationery. Jet brooches and hair combs glittered black as coal in glass cases. Death was polished into display. Was it comfort or commerce? Did satin linings soothe grief or only sell it? Imagine standing in that parlor, velvet curtains muffling the street, chandeliers glowing, silence broken only by the tick of an ormolu clock. Would you feel reverence or unease? Lincoln's funeral had set the precedent. His satin coffin and glass pane showed Americans that death could be prolonged, staged, adorned. From that expectation, a billion-dollar industry was born. So I'll ask you, if you stood in that showroom, would you pay for satin and silver or choose silence and pine? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to History's Ledger, so the next time we open the past, you'll already be here to turn the page with me. After Lincoln, mourning became visible, codified, public. Etiquette manuals instructed families how to grieve properly. Black was no longer just sorrow, it was uniform. Widows wore heavy crepe for 1 year and a day. veils long enough to brush the floor, jewelry limited to jet brooches or lockets of hair. Afterward came half mourning, when greys and muted purples cautiously replaced deepest black. A woman's dress became a calendar of loss. Men observed shorter spans, armbands or cravats for months. Children were dressed in somber cloth, their ribbons dyed black. Even letters carried grief, stationery edged with black borders, some so wide they dominated the page. Condolences, folded and sealed with wax, filled shoeboxes still found in archives today. Homes were reshaped, mirrors veiled in cloth, clocks stopped where death occurred, knockers draped in crepe, parlors hushed, heavy fabrics replacing color, lilies and hyacinths crowded rooms, their perfume masking the chemical tang of embalming fluid. Shops profited. Mourning emporiums in New York and Philadelphia displayed veils, parasols, combs, gloves, even gaslight dimmed to match sorrow. Window mannequins dressed head to toe in black signaled grief as commodity. The rules carried tension. A widow who shed her veil too soon risked whispers. A family who failed to order ribbons might be judged unseemly. Grief became performance as much as ritual. One fragment lingers, an 1860s invoice from a Baltimore stationer, 36 mourning sheets edged in black. The bill was never paid. Did the family choose silence instead of display? The absence says as much as the ink. Would you have obeyed these rules, cloaking yourself in black for years? Or rebelled, grieving quietly, risking judgment? The funeral train carried Lincoln north, velvet-draped cars trailing coal smoke. His coffin opened 13 times for the public. More than 1 million saw his face. Yet, almost no photographs survive of what they witnessed. By 1865, photography was common. Studios in New York and Philadelphia filled with portraits. Carte de visite traded like calling cards. But Edwin Stanton forbade photographs of Lincoln in his coffin. Officially, it was for dignity. Still, rumors persisted. Some whispered that in New York a photographer exposed a plate inside City Hall, capturing the coffin under chandeliers and velvet banners. Others claimed an image was taken in the White House before departure, lilies piled high, Lincoln pale but recognizable. Such prints, it was said, were seized, destroyed, or hidden away. Why were they suppressed? Witnesses described his face as wan and shrunken, skin darkened despite Catel's powders. A woman fainted, leaning close, overcome by lilies and heat. Would a photograph have shown reverence or too much reality? The absence feels louder than any picture. Newspapers offered sketches, lithographs smoothed into ideal likenesses, diaries recorded impressions instead of features. He looked at peace, wrote one. His face was dark, but serene, wrote another. Without photographs, memory splinters. And in Cleveland, among the wreaths, someone left a letter folded in blossoms. To the man who freed him. Unsigned, unopened, lost when the flowers were cleared. No photograph preserves it, only rumor. What else vanished? Negatives burned, plates cracked, faces erased. Did Stanton fear scandal, or simply know grief wasn't meant for glass? Would you have wanted to see one? A true image of Lincoln pale behind glass, ostrich plumes swaying, lilies stacked until air grew sickly sweet? Or would you prefer the silence, leaving memory untouched by camera? The funeral train rolled northward, through fields still scarred from war, velvet banners flapping against iron cars. Cities erupted in mourning, black crepe draped over marble facades, flags dipped in silence, streets choked with lilies and coal smoke. But one figure was missing from every station, every rotunda, every velvet-draped hall. Mary Todd Lincoln. She had retreated into a private chamber at the White House after April 15th, 1865. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered in black cloth, the air thick with flowers she could not bear to see. She remained in bed for days, her sobs muffled by the folds of pillows, her attendants hovering in silence. She would not walk beside the coffin, would not board the train, would not stand in the halls where a million eyes pressed forward to see her husband behind glass. Her absence hung heavier than any wreath. Mary's life had been a pageant of contradictions. She had worn gowns of silk brocade imported from Paris, diamonds glittering at her ears during receptions lit by chandeliers, her laughter ringing across polished floors. Guests whispered of her extravagance even as the war drained the treasury. She adored velvet curtains, gilded furniture, ormolu clocks ticking in gilded frames. Yet she was also a mother who buried 3 of her 4 sons, each loss tearing deeper. By the time Willie died in 1862, she had filled her rooms with lilies until their perfume made visitors dizzy. Now, with Abraham gone, grief consumed her. She spoke of joining him soon, her voice trembling, her body wrapped not in silks, but in mourning crepe. Imagine the scene in her bedroom. Gaslight turned low, the air sweet with roses left by sympathetic friends, their petals bruising in the heat. A silver hairbrush still sat on her vanity, its bristles tangled, but no hand touched it. A gown of black satin lay folded across a chair, unworn. On her desk, letters piled unopened, some edged in black, their wax seals unbroken. The widow sat in silence, her figure wrapped in shawls, her gaze fixed on the shuttered window. Outside, the city thundered with drums and funeral bells. Inside, time seemed to hold its breath. Edwin Stanton filled the void her absence created. The Secretary of War, stern, commanding, stepped into her silence with his own voice. He ordered the train to extend its route, decreed stops in city after city. Mary had wanted a direct journey home to Springfield. Stanton insisted the nation must grieve in public. Marble pedestals rose in city halls. Velvet swags hung heavy from balconies. Silver candelabras flamed in rotundas, while the widow lay in her bed, unseen. Was Stanton ruthless, or simply practical? understanding that the Republic needed performance to bind itself together after so much bloodshed. His decisions turned mourning into theatre, his hand evident in every ostrich plume and every imported mourning ribbon that adorned the pageant. Mary's voice was swallowed by the spectacle. Her absence created whispers. Newspapers speculated. Some called her too fragile, others unfit. But silence is its own mystery. Why did she not come? Did she fear the press of crowds, the sight of her husband's face retouched again and again by Dr. Cattell? Did she fear fainting under the perfume of lilies, the sweetness turned suffocating in halls already stifling with gaslight? Or was it defiance, a refusal to let Stanton's pageant claim her grief? One diary entry from a woman in New York noted, "We expected her, but she did not appear. Only the casket, velvet draped, silver handled, and the man within the absence was noticed. It became part of the performance, her shadow standing in every hall, even as her body remained in Washington. Imagine if she had walked beside the coffin, her veil trailing black crepe, her hand clutching a jet brooch, her face pale as marble. Would the crowds have wept louder? Or would the spectacle have collapsed into something too raw, too human for Stanton's pageant? Instead, she remained in shadows. The widow in black who never saw the coffin close, who never watched the ostrich plumes sway through towns, who never stepped onto the velvet-carpeted rotundas where marble and flowers swallowed silence. So which is more haunting, the million who saw his face through glass, or the one who could not bear to look at all? Would you have joined the pageant, standing beneath chandeliers and velvet swags to say farewell? Or would you, like Mary, have stayed behind the curtain, grief too heavy for display? Cleveland, April 28th, 1865. The sky was gray, heavy with spring rain. The train slowed into the city, coal smoke drifting over rooftops, its plume hanging like a veil. Crowds had already gathered in silence, umbrellas glistening, boots sinking into mud churned by thousands of feet. The coffin was carried to a rotunda, dressed overnight for the pageant. Velvet banners sweeping from ceiling to floor, silver-braided drapery looped along balconies, and gaslight chandeliers casting amber haze through the damp air. The coffin lay on a raised bier, its satin lining glowing faintly beneath the glass pane. Lilies were stacked in towering wreaths until the perfume pressed into the throat, sweet turning almost sour in the crowded hall. Roses spilled from vases, their petals darkening at the edges. Orchids, imported and rare, were placed near the head, their delicate scent lost amid the lilies' dominance. Guards in dark uniforms stood rigid, their swords gleaming as if polished only hours before. The line of mourners stretched for blocks. Some waited all night, the sound of muffled drums their only rhythm. They stepped slowly across marble floors, their damp clothing steaming faintly in the heat of lamps. The hall echoed with the shuffle of boots, the soft sobs of children clutching violets, the creak of benches strained by so many bodies. And there, at the coffin's foot, Among wreaths so dense they seemed like walls of flowers, one mourner slipped something into the blossoms, a folded sheet of paper, the ink smudged from damp fingers. On it, only 7 words: to the man who freed him. Unsigned, no date, no name. The paper was never opened again. No record tells who placed it there. A freedman, perhaps, who had traveled miles to see the face behind the glass. A mother whose son had not returned from war. A stranger who believed a single line was more lasting than weeping. The letter disappeared when the coffin was lifted again, wreaths cleared, flowers tossed aside. But its echo remains in every account that mentions it, a whisper in the excess of velvet, lilies, and silver. What does such a fragment mean? Was it confession, gratitude, or plea? Does its absence now speak louder than its words ever could? Imagine the moment. You are standing in that rotunda, the smell of lilies pressing into your chest, the chandeliers hissing with gaslight. You see the coffin, the satin, the silver, the glass pane reflecting your own pale face. And then you notice it, that small folded paper, tucked beneath roses, half hidden by orchids. Would you reach for it? Would you read the words? Or would you turn away, letting the mystery remain untouched? History recorded the flowers, the flags, the banners 30 feet long. But the paper? It lingers only as rumor and silence, and sometimes silence is more enduring than marble. Would you have left your own letter in the wreath? What would you have written? The coffin lid was designed for display. Walnut polish to a mirror, silver handles cool beneath the palms of pallbearers, the interior lined in tufted satin pale as milk. Across the top, a window of thick glass framed the president's chest and face. It was this pane, cold, unblinking, that turned Lincoln's funeral into something new. For the first time, the people could look directly upon their president in death. At each stop, the coffin was lifted from the train, the brass fittings glinting under torchlight. Carried into rotundas, churches, and courthouses, it was placed on velvet-draped platforms high enough that thousands could pass in long procession. The air inside those halls was dense, gaslight hissing in iron chandeliers, the perfume of lilies and hyacinths piled high on marble pedestals, the sour undertone of chemicals used to keep a body from fading too fast. Each mourner stepped forward, the floorboards creaking, their breath fogging faintly against the pane if they leaned too close. Behind glass, Lincoln's face waited. At first, the impression was uncanny. Witnesses in Baltimore and Harrisburg noted that he seemed at rest, pale but still recognizable, the tall man softened by silence. His beard, trimmed neatly, framed lips, pressed into stillness. His suit was black, the tie knotted firmly, every fold arranged by Dr. Henry Cattell's careful hand. But preservation was never perfect. By the time the coffin reached New York, whispers spread. His features, some said, appeared wan and shrunken. Others remarked that the color of his skin had darkened, powder and rouge unable to disguise the strain of distance, coal smoke, and time. Dr. Cattell traveled with the train, his trunk heavy with brushes, powders, and jars that smelled of camphor, arsenic, and vinegar. Each night, when halls emptied and guards stood watch, he opened the coffin once more. By lamplight he worked quietly, applying rouge to cheeks, brushing powder to forehead, pressing cloths damp with vinegar against skin that had begun to tighten and crack. His task was not healing, but illusion, holding back the truth long enough for the next city to pass by the glass. Imagine him alone in the chamber, the hiss of gas jets overhead, the satin lining glowing faintly, the President's still form waiting beneath his hands. Did he ever question the line between reverence and performance? The crowds did not pause to wonder. They pressed forward, hour after hour, hats in hand, gloves folded at their waists. Some whispered prayers, others wept openly, their tears falling on polished wood. The scent of crushed violets clung to hems of skirts, mixed with the sweetness of lilies until it overwhelmed. In Cleveland, a woman fainted as she neared the coffin, overcome by perfume and heat. In New York, lines stretched for blocks, the shuffle of boots on marble unending. More than 100,000 passed through, each one carrying home not memory of his life, but the sight of his face behind glass. There were tensions in that act. Some critics murmured that it was unseemly, that grief should not be displayed like an exhibition. Others argued it was necessary, that the Republic, scarred by war, needed to look upon him one last time. Behind the pain, Lincoln became more than a man. He became symbol, saint, spectacle. And yet, what of the photographs said to have been taken? In New York, rumors claimed a plate was exposed, capturing his face as it appeared, altered, darkened, far from the dignified visage the nation wanted to remember. Stanton ordered such images seized, perhaps destroyed. Some whispered that prints were locked away in government vaults, never shown. What would they have revealed? The powders brushed hastily across skin, the shadows under eyes retouched by candlelight, or simply the raw truth of death, no satin or silver strong enough to disguise it. Imagine yourself in that line, the smell of lilies thick, gas lamps buzzing, your shoes clicking against polished stone. At last you reach the coffin. You lean closer. Behind glass lies a face both familiar and altered, beloved yet unsettling. Would you feel comfort, as though his presence remained, or unease, realizing that death itself had been arranged, presented like an exhibit for the nation? The glass gave Americans a final gift and a burden. They could see him, but they could never unsee what time, distance, and chemicals had done. The lid of Lincoln's coffin was never meant to be disturbed so often. A coffin, after all, supposed to close once. Yet, on his final journey, the heavy walnut lid with its silver edging and thick glass sash was opened and shut 13 times. Each reopening pulled him back into view. Each closing pressed the weight of finality, only to undo it again at the next station. Imagine the sound of it, the click of brass clasps drawn tight, muffled by the fold of velvet banners. Then hours later, the scrape as they were undone, the groan of hinges in halls already heavy with the smell of lilies, guards lifting the lid with gloved hands, the glass pane catching the hiss of gas jets above. Every opening invited another city to stare through satin and glass. Every closing pretended it was the last. The train carried him across 1,600 miles. At each stop, the coffin was lifted down, the satin lining catching lamplight, the silver trim polished again by attendants who wiped away the coal dust of travel. Rotundas and courthouses became stages. In Philadelphia, marble pedestals gleamed cold beneath wreaths, stacked so high the perfume of roses smothered the air. In Albany, velvet swags hung across balconies, their folds absorbing smoke from thousands of candles. In Chicago, candelabras of crystal flickered above mourners who shuffled for hours, their breath fogging in the damp night air outside before they reached the hall. And each time the coffin was closed again, the satin-covered lid lowered, the brass handles glinting. Soldiers tightened ropes. The thud of wood echoed faintly in cavernous chambers, followed by silence broken only by muffled sobs. Then, as the train lurched forward once more, the pattern began again. Dr. Henry Cattell bore the heaviest burden of repetition. His trunk of powders and brushes traveled in the car beside the coffin. At every stop, he prepared the face anew. A cloth dampened with vinegar across the forehead, rouge pressed to lips, powder brushed into hollows where skin had tightened. By New York, witnesses whispered of his struggle, wan and shrunken, they said. Still, Cattell labored by lamplight, the smell of camphor and alcohol clinging to his coat. What passed through his mind as he retouched the same face again and again, knowing each time the coffin closed, it would be opened once more? Was this devotion, or a performance stretched to the edge of illusion? The strain showed not only in the body, but in the pageantry itself. Ostrich plumes that once swayed proudly atop the hearse grew ragged in rain. Velvet drapes darkened with soot. Even the flowers, imported at great cost, wilted before the coffin reached its next stop. Yet the mourners pressed forward. For them, each reopening was not repetition, but revelation, their only chance to see the man who had guided them through war. In Cleveland, when the lid lifted for the 6th time, someone pressed a letter into a wreath. To the man who freed him, no name, never opened. The coffin closed, the letter hidden among petals, carried forward into silence. 13 times the ritual repeated, 13 times the illusion was remade, and with each closing, the question deepened. Was the man inside still himself, or only a symbol maintained by powder, satin, and silver? Imagine standing in line after hours of waiting, the hall lit by gaslight, the air thick with lilies and sweat. You step forward. The lid is open again, the glass pane before you. You lean closer, heart pounding. Would you believe you were seeing Lincoln? Or would you sense you were staring at something else? Something altered, staged, strained by 13 closings too many. When the final lid shut in Springfield, the brass clasps clicked one last time. The thud of wood echoed in the tomb. And yet, even then, the sound must have felt uncertain, as though another reopening still waited. What is more haunting, the sight of his face behind glass, or the knowledge that the final farewell was rehearsed 13 times? The train rolled on, coal smoke trailing across fields, brass clasps clicking shut again and again, velvet banners flapping in cold wind. Crowds pressed forward in every city, but one figure was never there. Mary Todd Lincoln. The widow remained in shadows. At the White House, she withdrew into a private chamber after April 15th. Curtains drawn, mirrors covered in black cloth, lamps turned low. The air was close. Roses stacked in vases, their petals browning, lilies ordered by the wagon until their sweetness clung like syrup. She stayed in bed for days, her black crepe gown folded across a chair, unworn. Letters piled unopened on her desk, the black borders stark against white paper, their wax seals still unbroken. Mary's silence became part of the funeral itself. Each time the coffin was carried into a hall draped in velvet, placed beneath crystal candelabras and mountains of flowers, whispers followed. Where is she? Why does she not come? Stanton had taken control. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, insisted the nation must grieve together. He extended the route, added stops, rerouted the train. Marble pedestals were erected, silver candelabras lit. Black ostrich plumes swayed from the hearse. Mary asked for a direct return to Springfield. Stanton refused. Private grief was swallowed by public pageant. Imagine the tension in that absence. Crowds craned for a glimpse of the widow, only to see a coffin and a glass pane. No veil of crepe brushing marble floors. No pale hand clutching a jet brooch. No voice raised above the drums. What kept her away? Was it the fear of fainting under Lily's perfume? The air already heavy in those gaslit halls? Was it the sight of her husband's face retouched again and again until it was less him, more symbol? Or was it defiance, refusing to walk in the pageant Stanton staged, refusing to let grief be arranged like velvet drapery? One Washington reporter wrote, "The widow's absence hangs like a shadow over each procession. The man is carried, but the family is unseen." Her silence unsettled the pageant, even as the crowds cheered the spectacle. Picture her chamber at the White House, gaslight dim, roses wilting in vases, a silver brush resting unused on her vanity, curtains heavy with dust. Outside, the muffled throb of drums, the hiss of gas jets, the coffin carried once more through velvet and silver. Inside, the widow whispered only to herself, which grief endures more, the spectacle of a nation draped in black, or the silence of a single woman who could not bear to stand before the glass? Would you have stepped out, veiled in crepe, walking behind the coffin so the nation could see you weep? Or would you, like Mary, have remained behind the curtain, letting absence speak louder than presence? By the summer of 1865, death in America no longer ended in silence. It had become a pageant, and with pageantry came profit. Undertakers, once seen as simple tradesmen, returned from the war as businessmen. Their satchels of camphor and arsenic had preserved soldiers for journeys home, and now they opened storefronts in cities where velvet curtains and brass lamps made mourning itself a commodity. Shops displayed coffins upright, like cabinets, some plain pine, but many polished to a sheen, their interiors lined with quilted satin, their corners trimmed in silver edging, brass handles gleaming under the glow of gas chandeliers. Families entered in hushed tones. A widow in crepe gloves might trail her fingers across the smooth walnut, feeling the cool wood as if touching a threshold. Children pressed their noses to glass cases, displaying jet brooches carved black as coal. Mourning was no longer improvised. It was purchased. Etiquette manuals gave the rules. For widows, 1 year in heavy black crepe. Veils so long they brushed the floor. Gowns dull and unadorned, hands covered always. Then, half mourning, when greys, lavenders, and muted purples might replace the weight of black. Men wore black armbands, cravats, or gloves for shorter spans. Even children were dressed in somber fabrics, their bright ribbons replaced with black. To fail in these displays was to invite whispers, unseemly, disrespectful, too soon. Stationers profited too. Shops filled with paper edged in thick black borders, envelopes sealed with wax in colors of ash. Condolences traveled by post, their black edges declaring grief even before the words inside were read. Families tied them in ribbon, keeping bundles of sorrow as visible records of loss. Imagine walking into one of these emporiums, the air sharp with beeswax polish and the perfume of lilies in tall glass vases. Gaslight buzzing above, its warmth turning silver trim into tiny suns. In one corner, a coffin fitted with a small glass pane, the reflection of chandeliers rippling across its surface. You lean closer. Would you see comfort in that pane, or feel unease at the thought of a face arranged behind it? The Civil War had created need, but Lincoln's funeral created desire. If the president could be embalmed and displayed for millions, why not a father, a mother, a child? The idea of a quick burial faded. Families wanted more time, more arrangement, more display. Embalming let the body wait while relatives traveled. Coffins with satin linings allowed grief to appear softened. Wreaths of lilies ordered in wagon loads turned the air into perfume. And so undertakers rebranded as funeral directors. They hung gilt signs over doorways, their lettering as ornate as any jeweler's. Their parlors resembled drawing rooms, marble mantels, ormolu clocks ticking softly, damask curtains muffling sound from the street. Mourning had become a performance, staged with velvet, glass, and silver. But was it comfort or commerce? Did satin linings soothe grief or only sell it? Did etiquette books help the bereaved or shackle them to rules that turned sorrow into obligation? One fragment survives from the account book of a New York undertaker in 1868. One coffin, silver trimmed, satin lining, $80. One wreath, lilies and roses, $15. Stationery, black-edged, 3 dozen sheets, $2. 3 lines of ink, neat as any ledger. Behind them, a family wept. Picture yourself in that parlor. Chandeliers overhead, gas flames hissing, the scent of flowers thick as syrup. You sign your name at the bottom of the invoice, your grief translated into dollars. Would you feel comforted by the arrangement, or would you feel the unease of sorrow wrapped in commerce? Lincoln's satin coffin and glass panes set the precedent. The commerce of mourning followed quickly, filling shops with veils, brooches, stationery, and coffins that gleamed brighter than the tears shed above them. Would you have embraced this world, measuring grief in fabric, jewels, and silver trim, or turned away, holding your loss in silence, without etiquette to script it? By the late 19th century, America had remade death. The change had begun with a coffin lined in satin, trimmed in silver, drawn on a train draped with velvet. From Lincoln's funeral onward, embalming was no longer a strange battlefield trick or a curiosity for the wealthy. It became standard, expected, almost unquestioned. Death itself had been slowed, arranged, made into performance. But permanence carries its own unease. The very fluids once praised as miracles, arsenic, camphor, zinc chloride, had consequences. They preserved bodies long enough for far-flung families to gather, for wakes to stretch into days. They kept faces intact for glass-paned coffins and chandeliers of gaslight. Yet, as decades passed, stronger chemicals replaced them. Formaldehyde became the embalmer's weapon of choice, searing into flesh, halting decay. Bodies sealed in metal coffins, lowered into vaults lined with concrete, lingered for generations. Cemeteries filled with marble monuments, yes, but beneath the grass, a hidden archive of chemicals, metal, and permanence, unnatural to the earth. Imagine walking through one of those cemeteries around 1900. Gates of wrought iron groan on their hinges. Rows of marble gleam white against the sky. Inscriptions cut deep to outlast weather. The grass smells fresh from morning rain, but beneath it lies another scent, something acrid, faint, not of soil, but of man's insistence on control. The very ground had been changed, grief preserved with satin, metal, and chemical permanence. Not everyone was convinced this was progress. Quiet voices began to question whether America had made death too artificial. Was embalming prolonging dignity or defying nature? Were coffins padded with satin and polished to a sheen comforting or grotesque, disguising what could never be erased? Was grief soothed by chandeliers and velvet, or only delayed? By the early 20th century, a countercurrent stirred. Some began to seek simplicity. They argued for bodies returned to earth without chemicals, without vaults, without brass and silver. No satin-lined displays, no jet black veils dictated by etiquette manuals, just shrouds of plain linen, coffins of pine, graves dug shallow so the body could nourish the soil. They imagined cemeteries not as marble fields, but as meadows, wild flowers bending in the wind, trees planted above graves, bees humming where mourners once shuffled beneath velvet swags. Picture it, 2 paths. One leads into a funeral parlor, chandeliers glowing, coffins displayed upright with satin linings and silver trim. The smell of lilies pressed into vases, heavy and sweet, masks the sharp tang of formaldehyde lingering in the air. Every detail rehearsed, every silence arranged. The other path opens into a meadow, the air filled with pine and rain, the ground soft underfoot. A linen-wrapped body rests in earth, a tree planted above, roots curling downward. No chemicals, no velvet, only silence, sky, and soil. The conflict remains. Some families still cling to permanence, to coffins heavy with brass and satin, to embalming that holds the face for one last look under chandeliers. Others turn away, seeking earth instead of silver, silence instead of performance. It is a choice between spectacle and simplicity, between marble permanence and the quiet return of the body to ground. One undertaker's ledger from the 1890s records the transition clearly. One coffin, silver trimmed, satin lined, $90. One vault, reinforced concrete, $25. A few pages later, one pine coffin, unlined, $12. 2 entries in the same hand, but they represent entirely different philosophies of death. So which speaks louder, satin and silver that hold the illusion of permanence, or grass and soil that embrace impermanence? Would you choose the velvet-draped parlor, the lilies, the satin lining, the brass handles polished under gaslight? Or would you walk into the meadow, the shroud of linen, the wild flowers whispering above the earth? Tell me below, should history remember the age of velvet coffins and chemical permanence, or the quiet shift back to green simplicity? Like this video if you want these questions to keep echoing. Subscribe to History's Ledger and ring the bell, so the next page of the past waits for you when you're ready to turn it. On April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died behind a velvet curtain in a boarding house bedroom. What followed was more than mourning, it was transformation. His body, embalmed by Dr. Charles Brown and Dr. Henry Cattell, traveled 1,600 miles by train. At every stop, the coffin was lifted down, its walnut sides polished to a sheen, its lining a quilt of satin, its corners gleaming with silver trim. Ostrich plumes swayed atop the hearse. Marble pedestals rose beneath velvet banners. Crystal candelabras hissed with gaslight, their flames mirrored in polished brass. Over 1 million people filed past. They pressed gloved hands to glass, inhaled the perfume of lilies stacked in towers, bent their heads beneath banners 30 feet long. In Cleveland, one left a note folded into a wreath. To the man who freed him. Unsigned, unopened. A fragment swallowed by flowers, remembered only because whispers clung to it. 13 times the coffin was opened, 13 times it was closed. Each reopening offered one more glimpse. Each closing promised finality, only to undo itself at the next station. By New York, the face behind glass had changed. One, shrunken, powdered into illusion. Still, they came. For some, it was reverence. For others, it was spectacle. And out of this procession, a precedent was born. Death was no longer quick, private, or simple. It was arranged, extended, displayed. Embalming spread from battlefield necessity to household expectation. Undertakers became funeral directors, their parlors lined with coffins padded in satin, their windows dressed with mourning crepe, their shelves stacked with jet jewelry, black-edge stationery, and veils imported from France. Grief became language. Etiquette books told widows how many years to wear black. Shopkeepers sold ribbons by the yard. Loss became commerce. Not everyone accepted it. Some whispered of unease. Faces touched too often with rouge. Chemicals harsh against soil. Grief performed in velvet and chandeliers. A century later, new movements arose. Plain pine coffins, linen shrouds, graves dug shallow to let the body feed the meadow above. The green burial offered silence instead of satin, soil instead of silver. Yet the shadow of Lincoln's coffin remains. Every time a family chooses embalming, every time a coffin is displayed beneath chandeliers and lilies, they echo that train journey, those marble pedestals, that satin lining behind glass. So what is Lincoln's true legacy? Not only freedom, not only reunion, but the way Americans bury their dead. A velvet curtain drawn back, a coffin displayed like a stage, a president's body turned into precedent, and an industry that endures still. Would you have leaned close to the glass, your breath fogging its cold surface, to see him one last time? Or stepped away, uneasy at the pageant of grief, the commerce of mourning? Tell me what you think. Was this reverence or performance? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this journey through satin, silver, and silence has carried you tonight, like this video, subscribe to History's Ledger, and ring the bell, so the next page waits when you are ready to turn it. And when this book closes, another opens. Next time, we return to another president, one who lived not in satin-lined coffins, but in jewels, scandals, and defiance. A general who carried bullets in his chest and fury in his hand. Join me for the next video, Andrew Jackson's Presidential Scandals History, Tried to Forget. What would you choose to remember? His victories or his scars?